why do Republican billionaires make heroes out of killers? And I start out with this new law that Ron DeSantis is signing into office, or I believe maybe he already has. If he didn't do it last Friday, he's going to do it this week. And it eliminates legal liability for doctors and other medical professionals, including EMTs, if they choose to let you die on the scene or die on the operating table because of their, quote, moral, ethical, and religious convictions, end quote. I'm not making this up. This is verbatim from the law. Every word is in the law. This is from the header of the law that describes the law. It says, quote, that healthcare providers and healthcare payors have the right to opt out of participation in or payment for certain healthcare services on the basis of conscience-based objections, and prohibits discrimination or adverse action against healthcare providers who decline to participate in a healthcare service on the basis of conscience-based objections. You know, what's going on here is a strain of violent politics that has always been part of American politics. I would argue, if you look at what's going on in Turkey right now, and we'll get to that in the second or third hour of the program, that this has always been a part of every nation's politics. But, here in the United States, it's followed a very, very specific arc, a very specific trajectory. Leading up to the Civil War, well, really since the 1850s, I believe 1856 was the year the Republican Party was first formed. Since the 1850s, the Democratic Party had been the party that was defending slavery before the Civil War, and that was suppressing the black vote in the South after the Civil War. And the Republican Party had been the party that fought the Civil War on behalf of the North and freed the slaves, freed enslaved people, essentially. And that was the case right up until the 1960s, that, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, of wife beating, and of lynching, misogyny, racial hatred, religious hatred. And it wasn't the entire Democratic Party, but it was very much the Southern Democratic Party. In fact, these guys had a name for themselves. They called themselves Dixiecrats. And the Dixiecrats did everything they could to stop, basically any participation of people of color in American life. And what happened was in the 1960s, in 1964, in fact, and 65, the Democratic Party, under the leadership of Lyndon Johnson, in the memory of John Kennedy, who had proposed these things and then was assassinated in 63, the Democratic Party passed the Civil Rights Act in 64 and the Voting Rights Act in 1960. And this completely changed the Democratic Party. By the end of the 60s, all those Dixiecrats, or most of all of those Dixiecrats, had become Republicans. And in 68, 3 years after the 65 passage of the Voting Rights Act, you had Richard Nixon in the presidential election in 1968 when he ran against Hubert Humphrey. You had Richard Nixon employing, for the first time, the Republican Party employed what they called the Southern strategy, which is, hey, there's all these racists and bigots and wife beaters and haters and religious fanatics down in the South. All these crazed white people. Let's invite them into the GOP, because the Democrats have just spit in their faces. The Democrats are going all in for a colorblind, pluralistic, multiracial, multi-generational, multi-religious society. And those bigots down there don't like that, and they could be our edge. They could make the difference between Richard Nixon winning or losing the election. And, Nixon and the Republican Party's math was absolutely accurate. So, in the 1960s, in 1960, the Republican Party embraced the former Dixiecrats. Now they're Republicrats. Maybe I invented a word here. Or Dixie pubs. Dixie pubes? No, that's too. We'll forget that. Anyway. So now here's where we're at now. The Republican Party in Bonneville, Idaho, hosting Trigger Time with Kyle. So you can go shoot a A weapon of war with Kyle Rittenhouse, the guy who used that same weapon to kill 2 people and grievously wound a 3rd. Just this past week, politicians helped raise over $1 million for the guy who recently killed a homeless man in the New York subway. Ron DeSantis tweeted his support for him. Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted her support for him. And lo and behold, they raised $1 million. As my colleague on SiriusXM, Dean Obeidallah, noted in his excellent Dean's Report Substack newsletter, quote, "This is politics at its most dangerous. The Penny case," he's the killer guy, "should be decided by a jury, not used as a political prop to score points. Instead, DeSantis is sending a message that if you are supported by the GOP base, we'll have your back even if you kill someone." So here we are. Violence against racial, religious, and gender minorities has always been part of American politics, but now it's basically owned by the Republican Party. You know, I was in SDS back in the 60s, and I remember a couple of, members of our group that went off to join the Weather Underground in the late 60s. The SDS itself officially said, no, we're not part of that. We're not doing that. We're not doing violence, as did the Democratic Party. But Nixon, yeah. And so after Nixon was 68. So what happens in 1970? On May 1st, 1970, Ronald Reagan goes on television and says that young people protesting the Vietnam War are, quote, brats, freaks, and cowardly fascists, and adds, quote, "If it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement." That was May 1st, 1970. On May 5th, 4 days later, 4 were dead in Ohio, right, in the Kent State Massacre. By 2009, hate and violence were solidly part of the Republican political landscape. Andy Griffith made an ad in 2009 in favor of Obamacare. And he had so many credible death threats against himself and his family that he asked the Democratic Party to take down the ad out of fear that his family members of his would be assassinated. More recently, Oklahoma Republican Chair John Bennett, who, by the way, campaigned using pictures of himself and his children carrying weapons of war, called for Anthony Fauci's execution to cheers from a Republican audience. Like Duterte in the Philippines, Trump just called for the execution of young people for drug crimes. And DeSantis has changed the law in Florida. So Florida is now one of only 2 states where you can be executed, you can put to death by the state without a unanimous jury verdict. The other is Alabama, and they require 10 to 2. In DeSantis land, it's 8 to 4. I mean, this is violent crime in America is at a 30-year low, but Republican media and Republican advertisements portray America as some kind of dystopian hellscape. Why? Well, scare the hell out of Republican voters. You'll drive gun sales, which helps with the donations from the NRA, and which will lead to more deaths of American children. But as Stephen Peugeot notes, it's really kind of served to normalize this political violence. He says when you have individuals with large platforms like elected officials and media personalities, and they're talking about things like an impending civil war, it could lead folks to kind of take that to heart and then act on it. There was a story in our paper here, the Oregonian, over the weekend, about how a couple of black families drove 80 miles to Lincoln City, where they have really nice fireworks. This was on the 4th of July in 2020. And they were going to have a picnic with their kids and watch the fireworks. And a group of 7 white guys showed up with their pickup truck and their Trump flags, threw fireworks into the picnic of the black people, called them the N-word, waved Trump flags in their face, played loud Trump music at them, and then threatened to shoot them. They called the police. The Lincoln City police showed up. And what did the police do? Well, they formed a barricade between the black families and the Trump humpers to give the black families time to pack up and leave before the fireworks started. The headline in the Oregonian was, "Hundreds of Oregon hate crimes go unprosecuted every year." So why do right-wing billionaires fund this kind of stuff? They could end this tomorrow, because most of the Republican Party's funding is coming out of these right-wing billionaires and all of its support mechanism, whether it's radio, television, think tanks, all this kind of stuff. Why do they support it? Number one, They know that the haters are the margin that allows Republicans to hold elected office and control the Senate. And number two, if Republicans are voted out of office, the right-wing billionaires, the Republican-funding billionaires, know that they will be asked to pay more than the 3.4% income tax that the average billionaire in America pays. And they know that the fossil fuel industry will start getting regulated. And they're willing to sacrifice our children and our country for that. It's that simple.